Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories of seemingly harmless contests that went horrifyingly wrong. And I may be using the term harmless loosely because there's no amount of money that could get me to participate in the first contest. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. For more than a century, spectators and competitors have descended on Coney Island, New York for Nathan's famous International Hot Dog Eating Contest, which is held every 4th of July, during which participants have 10 minutes to consume as many hot dogs and buns as they can. Before continuing on, take a moment to think about how many hot dogs and buns you could consume in 10 minutes. And with that in mind, consider this. Famous competitive eater Joey Chestnut set the record in 2021 by eating 76 hot dogs and buns in just 10 minutes. For his troubles, Joey took home $10,000 in cash, and other than a little bloating and indigestion, he apparently suffered no ill effects from consuming so much in such a short time. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for a young Florida man named Edward, who entered a much less traditional eating contest in mid-October of 2012. We don't know much about Edward's background, but we do know that he was born on May 11th, 1980, that he was 32 years old in the fall of 2012, and that he had a 27-year-old fiancée named Natasha. According to Edward's friends, family members, and coworkers, he was funny, outgoing, and rarely passed up an opportunity for adventure and excitement. Maybe as a result of this, he didn't spend much time weighing the pros and cons when he heard about a bizarre contest being held at a nearby pet shop a few weeks before Halloween in 2012. It's unclear why Edward didn't tell Natasha about the contest until a few hours before it was scheduled to begin at midnight on Saturday, October 6th. But either way, when he did, she apparently asked him if he thought it was a good idea when he told her what he'd have to do to win. But he assured her it was nothing to worry about and that as horrible as it sounded, it wasn't that big of a deal. He also told her that he didn't even want the prize and that after he won, he was going to sell it to his friend and pocket the cash. The contest was organized by a man named Ben who owned a reptile store in a nearby city. By then, he'd been promoting the aptly named Midnight Madness event for weeks. During the contest, 30 participants would compete head-to-head in 3 4-minute rounds. In the first round, they'd consume as many live crickets as they could. In the second, they'd do the same with mealworms, but as disgusting as the first 2 rounds would be, they'd pale in comparison to the third and final round. For 4 excruciating minutes, when their stomachs were already full of crickets and mealworms, they'd have to suppress their gag reflexes and choke down as many 3 to 4 inch cockroaches as humanly possible. Now, you might be wondering what would compel someone to participate in this contest. But rather than a really awesome prize like a new car, an all-expense-paid vacation, or even $10,000 in cash, instead, the victor would take home a female ivory ball python valued at only about $1,000. Before leaving for the event, Edward made a last Facebook post in which he told his followers that the glory of winning was far more important than the snake or the money he'd get from selling it to his friend. Edward's snake-loving friend drove him to the contest in Deerfield Beach that night, and by all accounts he was happy, energetic, and eager to get started when he arrived at the pet shop. After a dramatic introduction, the contest finally got underway around midnight. As expected, the first 2 rounds were either incredibly disturbing or morbidly entertaining, depending on your perspective. The spectators watched as the contestants crunched and gagged their way through piles of crickets and mealworms. Nobody knew exactly how many insects each of the contestants consumed, but everyone agreed that Edward was squarely in the lead at the end of the second round. Apparently, while the other contestants wasted valuable time chewing, he gave each mouthful a few chomps before washing it down with water. And to everyone's amazement, he wasn't showing any signs of slowing down going to the last round. At that point, all he had to do was repeat what he already did in the first 2 rounds, obviously with the exception that he'd be eating giant cockroaches instead of little crickets and mealworms. But once again, over the next 4 minutes, he diligently downed dozens of crunchy, goo-filled roaches. And when it was all said and done, Ben declared him the victor. This should have been a time for strange gloating, accepting his prize, giving a short victory speech, and doing whatever he could to get the taste of bugs out of his mouth. But as the award ceremony got underway, he stumbled away and disappeared. People listened intently as the announcer told the crowd that the winner was vomiting somewhere and that they'd all give him a congratulations when he came back. Everyone assumed that Edward would feel better when he emptied his stomach and they'd all have a good laugh when he resurfaced to collect his prize. But after a heated bout of vomiting, Edward called 911 before collapsing on the sidewalk in front of the store. His friend eventually found him and yelled to the crowd that he needed help. We don't know how long it took for the ambulance to arrive, but Edward was barely conscious when EMTs took him away shortly thereafter. They did their best to stabilize his condition on the way, but sadly, emergency room physicians pronounced him dead just a few minutes after he was admitted. It goes without saying that Edward's friends, family members, and his fiancée Natasha were stunned and heartbroken by his death, and so were the other participants, spectators, and employees who were at the contest. Because he was otherwise healthy, some initially suspected that he might have had some sort of allergic reaction to the bugs or something they carried. But in the end, the medical examiner determined that he didn't die from an allergic reaction. Instead, he apparently died of asphyxiation when a clump of partially chewed cockroaches that should have gone down his esophagus became lodged in his trachea. By November of 2017, the Chinese daredevil Wu Yongning was gaining massive popularity on social media platforms for insane high-altitude stunts. This was so much so that he came across as invincible, earning himself the nickname the Chinese Superman. This air of invincibility was the product of years spent pushing his body, building strength, and learning how far he could push his own limits. He had trained in martial arts from a young age and developed the balance, grip, strength, and control that would later define his stunts. The feats Wu performed were part of an internet trend known as roof-topping, where climbers scale skyscrapers, poles, cranes, and anything else without any safety equipment. And for some, the untethered climbing alone isn't enough. Once on a roof, it's not uncommon for roof-toppers to perform dangerous tricks like doing handstands on ledges or dangling from the side of buildings to do pull-ups. Before roof-topping ever entered the picture for Wu, though, he had tried to break into television and film, landing small roles and stunt work that hinted at bigger ambitions. The payoff for those gigs was inconsistent, however, and the attention he wanted never quite materialized in those industries. Social media, though, completely changed all that. When Wu began posting videos of himself climbing and hanging off of skyscrapers, the response and the gratification were immediate. The clips were short and shocking as viewers watched him stand on ledges hundreds of feet above the ground with no visible safety gear, calmly posing against breathtaking city skylines. Each video brought more followers, more attention, and eventually money, and what started as a risky venture quickly became a career. By late 2017, Wu had uploaded hundreds of videos and built a massive following online. Sponsorships followed, and with them came expectations. The more extreme the stunt, the more views it drew, but he often reminded his viewers not to copy what he was doing, even as he continued to raise the stakes himself. Now, roof-topping may have been the world Wu was operating in, but he wasn't necessarily a pioneer in the trend. By the time his videos began circulating widely, the stunts had already earned a dedicated worldwide following of their own. The practice grew out of urban exploration, a movement built around accessing places most people never see up close. Over time, some climbers pushed further and higher, and cameras came along with them to record every death-defying moment. In China, platforms like Weibo made it easy for Wu and his fellow roof-toppers to easily reach massive audiences, and the pursuit of more views, likes, and followers became part of each climb. As you might imagine, though, across the world, roof-topping had already proven deadly for some participants, but the risks hardly slowed the trend. And despite the inherent dangers, many climbers argued that the safety gear undermined the entire experience and turned something that was supposed to be raw into something that looked and seemed staged. By the fall of 2017, Wu's success online had translated into real income, but it wasn't the kind that offered total financial security. Sponsorships and platform payouts depended on continued attention, and attention can be difficult to hold. Around that time, Wu agreed to take part in what was described as a roof-topping challenge put forward by a sponsor. Details of the sponsorship are scarce and they've never been fully clarified, but what was known was the prize. It was a substantial cash payout, reportedly around 100,000 yuan, or the equivalent of around $15,000 at the time. For Wu, that money was crucial. He was planning to propose to his girlfriend the day after he completed the challenge, and he needed the funds not just for a wedding, but also to help cover medical care for his mother who was seriously ill. With all of that at stake, on November 8th, Wu made his way to a building in the capital of Hunan province in China. At more than 60 stories, the skyscraper was one of the tallest buildings in the city. At some point that day, Wu took an elevator up to around the 40th floor, where he made his way outside and began climbing the side of the building. He managed to scale upwards of 20 floors before reaching the spot where he planned to film. What happened next was captured on video, and it's a horrifying clip. The footage, which is roughly a minute long, would not surface publicly until weeks later, but it documented Wu's final moments with chilling clarity. In the recording, Wu reaches the roof and lowers himself back down over the edge, positioning his body carefully as he grips the ledge. He pauses for a moment, wipes his hands along the surface of the ledge, and then hangs fully off the side of the 60-story building with his arms extended above him. Wu then performs 2 pull-ups, lifting his body level with the roof each time. After the second attempt, however, something changes in his demeanor under pressure. He fumbles around for a foothold he can't quite find, and for a moment it looks like panic sets in. He then tries to pull himself back onto the roof, but the effort falls short. He drops back into a hanging position, then tries again, but that attempt fails as well. As the seconds pass and his remaining strength fades, Wu continues dangling from the side of the building, and it appears that his grip begins to weaken. His hands slide along the ledge, and a faint sound, possibly a strained breath or a groan, can be heard on the recording. In the next few seconds, Wu would lose his hold entirely and fall out of frame. Later that day, his body was discovered by a window cleaner on a building terrace, leading police to conclude that he dropped roughly 45 feet. He'd suffered fatal injuries and died during or shortly after the fall. When he didn't return home that night and failed to respond to calls or text messages, his girlfriend contacted the police the following day to report him as missing, but police would soon connect the dots and she'd learn of his tragic fate. For weeks afterward, there was no public explanation for his disappearance. As days passed, his followers noticed that he hadn't posted in a while, and questions about his whereabouts soon filled up comment sections on his previous posts. When his final video was released by police in December of 2017, Wu's sudden lack of online activity became tragically clear. Once the video became public, reaction was swift and divided. For many viewers, watching Wu's final moments was deeply unsettling, but for others, it sparked broader questions about the online economy that helped fuel his rise to notoriety. His success wasn't unusual, as creators across the internet were pushing boundaries to hold attention and chasing views with stunts that were increasingly difficult to scroll by. Critics argued that the social media economy rewarded risk without accounting for consequences. This caused the line between performance and personal survival to grow thinner over time for Wu. But although his widely circulated death and final footage may have created controversy over social media platforms, it did nothing to deter other climbers from continuing the trend of roof-topping, sometimes with tragic results. In 2019, a New York climber died after falling from a 6-story building. In the summer of 2023, a French urban climber died after falling 68 floors from a Hong Kong building during a roof-topping stunt. That same summer, a 22-year-old Canadian man who claimed to have been addicted to roof-topping for the better part of 6 years died during a climbing stunt. This is hardly an exhaustive list of accidents that have occurred during roof-topping ventures, but it illustrates the deadly risk climbers take when they scale structures for online clout. In the end, Wu is remembered as a daring climber, a viral star, and a young man trying to build a future for himself and his family. The Chinese Superman was just 26 years old when he captured his final footage. In late May of 2021, a Chinese ultramarathoner named Mao made one of the biggest decisions of her racing career. While more than 100 of her fellow competitors pressed on, she turned back just 24 kilometers into the 100-kilometer Gansu ultramarathon. At first, she couldn't help but wonder if she overreacted. As she ran back to the starting line, she even thought about how foolish she'd feel when everyone else completed the race. But later, it would turn out she couldn't have been more right about her decision. The annual Gansu ultramarathon was established to promote tourism and generate economic activity in Gansu province, which is located in one of China's poorest and least developed regions. After nearly a year of planning and coordination, the first race took place in 2018 in the rugged country outside the town of Beiyin in north-central China. Despite many challenges, it went off without a hitch, and so did the subsequent races in 2019 and 2020. At that point, there was no reason to suspect that 2021 would be any different. Like the earlier races, it consisted of 3 distinct events spread over 3 consecutive days. The first was a 5-kilometer run, the second was a 21.1-kilometer half marathon, and on the last day was the much more grueling 100-kilometer trail run. It's unclear how many participants signed up for the first 2 events, but we know that 172 racers registered for the Ultra. They were all relatively experienced athletes because each participant had to prove that they completed a similar race of at least 50 kilometers within the past year. Of those who entered, 31-year-old Liang Jing was by far the most well-known. He was famous for completing another 100-kilometer race in just 6 hours, and he also won a 400-kilometer race through the Gobi Desert in 2018. He had also actually won the Gansu Ultramarathon trail runs in 2018, 2019, and 2020. Now, the 100-kilometer race in Gansu was what's known as a single-stage event. That means that competitors complete the race in less than 24 hours. Most of the runners were expected to finish in somewhere between 10 and 19 hours, but again, for elite runners like Liang, it would probably take between 7 and 9 hours. At least it would if everything went according to plan. The 2021 race was set in Yellow River Stone Forest, about 60 kilometers north of Beiyin, and in many respects, it was the perfect setting for the event. The area is famous for its mountains, deep canyons, and thick forested areas, all of which are dotted with these towering stone pillars. But at the same time, the course was different than it had been in previous years. Some of the runners liked that the organizers changed the course from year to year because it made the race even more challenging and rewarding. On the other hand, a new route through new territory also meant new unknowns. In 2021 as well, the starting line was located in the park near the scenic viewing area, about 1,600 meters above sea level. That's about 5,000 feet. There would also be 9 checkpoints spread across the course, though some wouldn't be staffed during the event. And each section of the course presented its own unique challenges, but runners would face the most difficult terrain, the biggest change in elevation, and be the most exposed to the elements while navigating through the 8-kilometer stretch of high ground between these second and third checkpoints. If they ran into trouble here, they wouldn't be able to rely on shelter, hydration stations, or even first aid assistance. With that said though, each runner got a GPS device so they could communicate with event coordinators near the starting line in the event of an emergency. The weather had been relatively hot and sunny for the first 3 Gansu ultramarathons, but local forecasts indicated that it would be cooler, milder, and possibly wetter in 2021. On the night of Friday, May 21st, the day before the race, the Provincial Meteorological Center issued a low-grade wind warning. It predicted that wind speeds would hover between 30 and 50 kilometers in and around the area. Even so, nearly all of the participants had faced worse conditions in the past, and besides, what better way to up the challenge on an already grueling endurance race than by adding a little inclement weather? With that also said though, the report also stated that thunderstorms, lightning, heavy rain, and hail were a possibility and that the occasional wind gusts might top 60 kilometers an hour. It's unclear who had access to the weather or if some or all the information was passed on to the racers, but whatever the case, conditions remained mild and peaceful for the rest of the night. It was chilly and overcast the following morning when many of the racers showed up wearing athletic shorts and t-shirts. Those who ran the Gansu ultramarathon in previous years remember just how hot it was. They also knew that carrying unnecessary gear and clothes would slow them down and put them at a disadvantage. At the end of the day, every bit of extra weight they'd have would be weight they'd carry for 100 kilometers. And as for the official race manual, it stated that windbreakers and other poor weather gear were recommended but not mandatory. The temperature was 7 degrees Celsius or 45 Fahrenheit on the morning of Saturday, May 22nd, 2021, as more than 170 elite ultramarathoners stretched and warmed up about an hour before the race. By then, hundreds of spectators, journalists, event staff, and party officials had arrived to make sure that the send-off was as festive and dramatic as it possibly could be. Then, at exactly 9 a.m., the mayor of Bayan raised his hand skyward, looked over at the eager racers, and fired the starting pistol. All at once, the athletes began running down the rocky trail toward checkpoint 1. The first stage was pretty uneventful, but as it went, things changed quickly. The temperature was dropping, and the wind was picking up, and dark clouds were forming on the horizon. But even so, the runners eventually warmed up and found their strides. Liang Jing was in the lead when he passed checkpoint 2 at 10:42 a.m. At the time, he was one of the few racers wearing a light windbreaker, and other than 4 elite competitors at his heels, pretty much everyone else was between 20 and 30 minutes behind. Around the same time, one early straggler was Mao. By then, things had changed so much that she was being pelted by sleet and rain, and the wind was so strong that she had to crouch over and place her palms flat on the ground to prevent herself from being blown away. To make matters worse, the temperature had plummeted to near freezing, and it felt significantly colder with wind chill factored in. So, just 24 kilometers in, Mao made the difficult decision to turn back. To her surprise though, most of the runners around her continued on into the rough weather, and unfortunately, the conditions were even worse up ahead. Shortly thereafter, things got so bad that the racers were shivering uncontrollably and losing feeling in their extremities. Some continued on, while others turned around and began heading back toward the starting line, which was at least an hour away. Those who turned back hoped the weather would improve as they descended toward the valley, and it did a little bit. But even despite this, the runners came across dozens of fellow racers strewn across the course. Some were dazed, delirious, unresponsive, and hypothermic. According to some eyewitness accounts, a few were foaming at the mouth, and some even looked like they were already dead. And even those who were still moving looked like they wouldn't be in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, the racers in the lead had reached the summit near checkpoint 3 about 2,200 meters or 7,300 feet above sea level. As visibility dropped to nearly zero, they veered off the trail and couldn't find their way back. At that point, it was hard to ignore that the race was officially over and they were in serious danger. All they could do was try to find shelter, cling together to conserve body heat, and hope the storm relented before they all died. Race organizers received the first GPS distress signal at 11:50 a.m., less than 3 hours after the race began. But for reasons unknown, nobody ever responded. Shortly thereafter, the organizers got a WeChat message from another terrified runner who managed to find a pocket of cell phone coverage. A few minutes later, another racer sent a photo of 10 drenched and shivering runners huddled together somewhere along the exposed portion of the course between checkpoints 2 and 3. By then, with 3 distress calls, the organizers dispatched more than 24 search and rescue personnel who were on standby near the starting line. About 2 hours later, they guided 18 runners to a small lodge at the base of the mountain. However, nearly 150 racers were still missing, and the weather wasn't showing any signs of letting up. As this was going on, a local shepherd named Zhu spotted a number of racers on the mountainside near his grazing grounds. Some were unconscious by the time he got to them, but he managed to save half a dozen lives by guiding them to his home nearby. He even went back for others when the first group reached safety, but sadly, they were already gone by the time he got there. Meanwhile, as dire as the situation was, the organizers apparently didn't seek outside help until nearly 3 hours after receiving the first distress call. And when they did, a high-level official sent this vague and casual message to the mayor of a nearby town, quote, "We need to bring winter supplies to the athletes." The mayor eventually passed the message on to a chief of a nearby village closer to the course, but it's unclear what, if anything, he did with it. 2 hours later, the mayor got a frantic call from the shepherd Zhu, who told him just how serious the situation was. Finally, from there, the full-fledged rescue effort got underway. County firefighters were then dispatched at about 4:20 that afternoon, but they were 33 kilometers away and wouldn't get there until nearly 9 p.m. That meant that by then, many of the runners had been out in the storm for almost 12 hours, some in just t-shirts and shorts. Luckily, nearly 24 racers survived by huddling together in a number of small caves between checkpoints 2 and 3. Even despite this though, by nightfall, they'd largely resigned themselves to the fact that they might not be found until the storm subsided, and that might not be enough time. Maybe the only saving grace was that an hour before firefighters arrived at about 8 p.m., nearly 60 local elderly villagers emerged from the darkness near checkpoint 3. Unlike the hundreds of soldiers, police officers, and search and rescue personnel who eventually showed up with drones and thermal imaging equipment, they brought simple life-saving gear like sweaters, coats, and blankets. They would also find Liang Jing in a cave with 3 runners, but sadly, he was dead by the time they got there. The recovery effort would eventually include more than 1,200 people and lasted well into the following day. It's unclear how many racers were rescued and how many made it to safety on their own, but in the end, 18 men and 3 women lost their lives that day. Of those, most were far in front of the other competitors. So in a tragic twist of fate, it was their speed that put them on a collision course with the storm at the moment it hit the most exposed portion of the course. In the aftermath, 8 additional runners were hospitalized with non-life-threatening injuries, and unsurprisingly, the tragedy caused quite a public outcry. The authorities offered the victims' families what were seen as meager compensation packages in the wake of the tragedy, but most allegedly turned them down because what they really wanted were answers and, above all else, accountability. Local and national authorities eventually launched a number of official investigations. Investigators would go on to find that many organizers did very little hands-on work leading up to the event, and they failed to oversee the actions of those who did. They also concluded that all of the checkpoints should have been manned and stocked with food, water, and potentially life-saving gear, and that the members of the search and rescue team were inexperienced and ill-equipped. Tragically as well, some well-intentioned rescuers may have ignored runners who appeared to be dead simply because they weren't trained to spot the symptoms of hypothermia. As a result of all of this, a number of organizers and coordinators were eventually arrested and charged with crimes including negligence, bribery, and dereliction of duty. At about the same time, China's Sports Administration temporarily suspended all high-risk sporting events, including ultramarathons, until organizers could prove that the proper safety measures were in place.
If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.